Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating analysis that suggests a massive global geopolitical shift is happening right now. And honestly, the wildest part? It's hiding right behind the noise of the US-China trade war. While the headlines are completely dominated by tariffs and economic showdowns, our source material points to a completely different chessboard, one where a much quieter but way more permanent game is being played.
Take a look at this number, 20%. Now, you might be thinking that's a tariff percentage, right? It's not. That 20% is actually the staggering amount of the world's oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about a ridiculously narrow strip of water right between Iran and Oman. When you put that into perspective, you really start to realize why the stakes are just so high here, and why focusing only on trade deficits might mean we're missing the main event entirely. So here's the core thesis of our source material, brilliantly illustrated. On one side, you've got the loud, above-the-surface trade war everyone's talking about, right? Chip restrictions, electric vehicle bans, all that maximalist language. But then, look below the surface. Down there, China is quietly executing a totally different geopolitical strategy. They're basically bypassing the trade war altogether, focusing instead on port infrastructure, diplomatic brokering, and massive energy deals over in the Middle East. Section 1. The global jugular vein. Why the Strait of Hormuz matters.
The analysis emphasizes that the Strait of Hormuz is way more than just a shipping lane. It is literally the absolute jugular vein of the global economy. It comes down to a very simple equation. Whoever controls that strait doesn't just control a bunch of oil. They control the leverage over every single nation that depends on that oil. So essentially, that's leverage over almost every country on Earth.
And, America has understood this reality for decades. The source points out that the entire post-war American grand strategy in the Middle East was built on one unshakable principle: no hostile power shall control the Strait of Hormuz. From the 1980 Carter Doctrine all the way to the Fifth Fleet being based in Bahrain right now, the whole U.S. military architecture in the region exists to protect this specific artery. But as we're about to see, the landscape is definitely shifting.
Section 2. China's quiet escalation, moving beneath the surface.
This timeline really tracks how rapidly things are shifting beneath the radar. We start with historical U.S. dominance back in 1980. But then, look at this massive leap in 2021, when China signs a 25-year, $400 billion comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran. Fast forward to 2023, and Beijing actually steps in to broker peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And today, we are seeing active physical infrastructure being built. It's a very methodical, step-by-step progression.
And according to the source material, these are definitely not just paper agreements. Chinese engineering firms are actively building port infrastructure on Iran's southern coast. We're seeing joint naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman with China, Russia, and Iran. Chinese investment is heavily flowing into Iranian energy. Because Western sanctions have left Iran economically desperate, the analysis argues that China is capitalizing on this exact need to plant a highly durable strategic flag in the region. And the kicker? They're doing all this while maintaining open diplomatic channels with literally every other player. Now, the strategic brilliance here is brokering that Saudi-Iran peace deal. Saudi Arabia and Iran had been locked in a cold proxy war for decades. So by getting them to shake hands in Beijing, China didn't just score some symbolic PR points. They neutralized the Sunni-Shia divide, which the source identifies as the single greatest structural barrier to Chinese influence. By pulling this off, China strategically positioned itself above the regional chaos as an indispensable, neutral broker, which kind of makes the American military presence look less like a stabilizing force and a bit more like an uninvited guest.
Section 3. The superior pitch. Two different offers for the Middle East.
Our source fascinatingly contrasts the diplomatic bargains currently being offered to the Gulf states by Washington and Beijing. Side by side, it's a stark difference. The analysis breaks down the U.S. pitch as highly binary. Align with America, confront Iran, apply maximum pressure. The Chinese pitch, on the other hand, is incredibly flexible. Beijing is essentially telling the Gulf states, hey, we won't ask you to choose sides. Keep your friends. We'll buy your oil, build your infrastructure, and help manage regional security so you don't have to go to war. You can really see why the source argues this economically driven alternative is looking so appealing.
And, well, the region is responding. Just look at these hedging actions. Saudi Arabia is now selling more oil to China than to any other country. The UAE has become a major financial hub for Chinese flows that bypassed Western sanctions. Even Qatar, which actually hosts the largest American airbase in the Middle East, is deepening its energy ties with Beijing. The source stresses that these nations aren't necessarily betraying America, they're simply rational actors hedging their bets and taking the more attractive deal. But the net effect of all this is that the strategic geography is slowly but surely shifting toward China.
Section 4. Structural over military control. The new permanence.
Okay, let's unpack the most profound concept from our source material, structural control. This is where we look at the difference between traditional military dominance and what is actually happening on the ground today. The source argues that to control a strategic waterway in the modern era, China doesn't actually need a literal military base with a giant red flag or warships enforcing passage rights. Instead, they're achieving dominance through economic dependency, political relationships, and the credible threat of disruption. It's a much more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful form of control.
Here is exactly how that structural control is built. Step 1. Secure economic agreements that give you solid leverage. Step 2. Build diplomatic relationships with all the players, so you become the only one capable of managing tensions. Step 3. Invest in physical coastline infrastructure. The analysis states that by building these 3 pillars simultaneously, China gains effective, quiet control over the exact conditions under which the Strait of Hormuz operates.
This quote perfectly encapsulates the disconnect. You cannot put semiconductors on a ship and park it in the Gulf of Oman. This highlights the core critique of the analysis. American tools designed for a trade war, like tariffs, decoupling, and tech restrictions, are completely ineffective in a grand strategic competition for infrastructure and regional loyalty. You simply cannot tariff your way to dominance over the Strait of Hormuz. And here is why this matters so much right now. The source warns that the timeline here is dangerous. The port contracts being signed and the diplomatic relationships being cemented today are not things that can be easily undone by the next American president. Infrastructure lasts 30 years. Strategic dependencies are enormous and incredibly difficult to unwind. So while the U.S. focuses heavily on the next election cycle and the daily noise of the trade war, China is out there locking in generational permanent shifts.
So I'll leave you with this provocative question drawn directly from the source material. While the U.S. fights a very public trade war, is China quietly winning the next generation of global power right there in the Persian Gulf? It's a completely different way to look at the headlines you see every day, and it really forces us to ask what true leverage actually looks like in the 21st century. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I hope this breakdown helps you see the board from a totally new perspective. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.